What's up everybody, I'm Derek, this is Rocking eForge, and today is part 3 of Weird Weapons of History, a series where I do the research and briefly cover historical edged weapons that I find particularly unique. Today's weird weapon is the Kpinga, sometimes known as the Hungamunga, which is a very unique weapon attributed to the Zande or Azande people of Central Africa. Now the reason I chose the Kpinga as today's weird weapon of history is due to its very unique multi-blade construction. The Kpinga is typically made with 3 to 4 straight or sickle-shaped blades. However, these blades do have many variations from a bulbous circular shape to very odd-looking angular check marks. And they can have any combination of all of the preceding blade types and shapes that I discussed previously. Now, these were a very interesting and, in my opinion, crazy-looking weapon, and no two Kpinga were alike. The sources do vary whether or not the Zande or Azande tribe or people were called one or the other, so I'm going to continue referring them to one or the other throughout the video. One of the other reasons that I chose the Kpinga as today's weird weapon of history is because it was associated with the Zande men's masculine power, if you know what I mean. And they were used as part of the dowry or wedding package to the family of the bride when a Zande man was proposing to the bride's family prior to marriage. Now, in the research that I went through, it was difficult to find a particular year or era that the Kpinga was originally created. However, it was attributed primarily to the Zande people, and the Zande people were established, so to speak, in the early 18th century. So that gives us a rough estimate as to the time frame of when the Kpinga may have come into use by the Zande warriors. Now, the area of Central Africa that the Zande people inhabited is now along the borders of current-day Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Central African Republic, and it was used by various other tribes and kingdoms throughout the area. Now, the Zande people were considered expert blacksmiths of the time, and it's little wonder when you look at the actual shapes that they were able to get out of their ironwork for the various designs and styles of the Kpinga. Some sources do mention the concept of court metal, or the idea that the Kpinga was forged for the governor of the Zande people and then distributed to those members of the Zande people who were a part of the standing army, so to speak. And I use air quotes because it was unclear as to whether the sources used standing army in the same way that we would in the 21st century. However, there did seem to be a certain subsection of the Zande people who were the regulars of their military force or armed force. The Kpinga was purported to have been used to mark, so to speak, the members of the trained army of the Zande people. And during times of war, this would differentiate those who were heavily trained warriors as opposed to just the general population who were added to the ranks to aid in their numbers. Some sources assert that the Kpinga was so important to the Zande people that the Zande warriors equipped with Kpinga were required to exhaust their supply of throwing spears prior to using the Kpinga, and were even required to announce the use of each Kpinga that would be thrown in order to avoid slighting the royalty of the Zande people. Now, other sources suggest that this may have just been a way to avoid friendly fire during battle, or to even give the enemy a fair chance and say, hey, I'm gonna throw this thing. If it hits you, you might die. Give the enemy the chance to either surrender or run away. Now, if the Kpinga was in fact only distributed to the warrior class of the Zande people, this would require the Zande men to prove themselves as warriors prior to receiving a Kpinga and being able to propose to a woman for marriage. However, none of the sources that I looked through made this assertion, so it may not have been as large of a portion of the dowry as it seems to have been described in certain sources. Many sources that I looked at did assert that the Zande warriors carried up to 4 Kpinga held on a ring that was built into the shield, and they would carry spears with them for the main part of combat. Once they exhausted those spears, then they were allowed or moved to the Kpinga as a primarily thrown weapon, but it could be used for hand-to-hand combat as well. Each of these sickle shapes, or the straight blades, or the bulbous circular blades were all sharpened, such that when the blade was thrown either overhand or sidearm, it would rotate, and pretty much at any point of the rotation, one of those blades would stick into the target and cause serious damage. These weapons tended to be fairly heavy for a thrown weapon. They didn't have very long ranges, but they did have a significant enough mass that it would cause a decent amount of damage to whatever they hit. And numerous sources called out specifically the fact that these weapons could be thrown either overhand in a vertical manner, like a tomahawk, or very specifically called out throwing either sidearm or horizontally low to the ground in order to wound the enemy's legs or feet during combat. Now this, I'm not sure why it was so heavily called out by as many sources as I found that in, but it is interesting to see that that was a tactic used by the Zande people even back in the 18th century. Now the Kpinga has been highlighted in various forms of media throughout recent history, specifically being used by Buffy the Vampire Slayer and being highlighted as one of the final round weapons in Forged in Fire, specifically season 3 episode 6, and both of those shows referred to the Kpinga as the Hungamunga, which is why it's probably more known, at least in the Americas, as the Hungamunga and not the Kpinga. This, I believe, is more of a colloquial term as opposed to any reference to the actual Zande people or what they called it. They seem to have different names even than Kpinga, but I can only call it one thing. So Kpinga is the name that I chose to go with. It seemed that each tribal people in Africa that used a similar weapon called it a different thing and had their own variations as well. I specifically used the Kpinga and called out the Zande people in this video. However, feel free to do more research and let me know if I got anything wrong in this video down in the comments section. Now the Kpinga is a fascinating weapon unlike any other that I've ever seen, and due to the complexity of the blade shape and design, I considered not including it in this series regardless of how weird it is, because I do intend to make all of the weapons that I highlight in Weird Weapons of History. And I'm still very seriously wondering how I'm going to tackle such a very odd and difficult blade shape, but that's a problem for future me. If you want to see me make this weapon or any others included in this series, please drop a comment down below, and while you're down there, let me know what weird weapon you want me to cover next. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like, leave a comment, hit subscribe, ring that notification bell. If you want to support me and the channel further, please consider becoming an honorary striker on my Patreon. Link is in the description below the video, and as always, keep on rockin'.